Okay, welcome back, everybody. Now, I want to run through a few critical perspectives on gender and mainstream media. And if you've taken media studies courses, you may be familiar with some of this stuff already. But if not, this may be new to you. And by critical perspectives, I mean perspectives which are involved in critique and pointing out, okay, this is not so good. This is happening because this, and it's not great, and it ought to change. So, critical perspectives always incorporate the idea that things are not as they should be, and that some kind of alteration or some kind of change in the direction of greater equity is desirable. And what, again, as in the other part of the lecture, we're going to really be focusing on representations within mainstream media. So we could talk about producers of media or people who work in media. There's a whole world of research and study on of receptions of media, like what sense do we make out of the things that we consume. But for today, we're focused on representation. So almost all critical perspectives on media agree that stereotyping is a problem with the way gender is represented, and that stereotyping, for a variety of reasons, is not a good thing. So, by stereotyping, we refer to reducing complex things basically to very simple and generalizable elements. One definition of stereotyping holds that a stereotype is what happens when a um, a text, which can be words, it can be music, it can be visual, what have you, consistently makes links between membership in a group, like you're a member of the group women, or the group African American people, or the group queer, um, and particular individual level characteristics. So your group membership, or the group membership of a character that's being portrayed, almost predetermines or sets out the individual level characteristics and behavior that are presented. So, the dizzy blonde, the stereotyping of black male actors as criminals or thugs or what have you, until quite recently, when non-heterosexual people were on um, TV or in the movies, it was almost always as a sort of comic relief. They were, being queer or being gay made you funny, and so therefore, when you're represented, that it's in the context of something, of being a joke, or there being something kind of humorous about you. So it's this linkage between the group, the category that someone is attached to, and the individual level behaviors or characteristics that are ascribed to that character, to that person being portrayed, that creates a stereotype. The antithesis of stereotyping is not the removal of all group membership. It's not like everyone on TV is going to be completely um, genderless, and we're going to remove that from uh, the dynamic altogether. But it's a move in towards more complex gendering, rather than the simplicity of, you belong to this category, therefore you're going to be portrayed in this way. Complex gendering involves inconsistent and sometimes contradictory representations of gender, of how being a man, being a woman, being non-binary, um, is not just a simple matter of, we can ascribe these characteristics to the individuals, but is a matter of constant negotiation, sometimes contradictions, sometimes there are disjunctions. In other words, just like in real life. And many of this can be done on TV or in movies. The example that I often give when I'm able to like show clips of things and so forth, is the way gender was portrayed in The Sopranos for its run on TV. Um, very, very violently patriarchal society, yet you could see within it the negotiations and the movements and the different configurations and deployments of gender as a way of exerting power and control in some uh, angles of the show and resisting or subverting or transforming it in others. So it is possible to engage with gender and group membership, but not do it in a simple stereotyping way. Yet, nonetheless, we still continue to see a lot of stereotyped gender representations of gender in our media. And here's why certain schools of thought think that this is not so good. The schools of thought I want to talk about are liberal critics, Marxist critics, radical critics, and then a postmodern approach, which really isn't criticism as such. It's more of an appreciation for complexity and contradiction, but we'll get to that at the end. So let's take a look at the liberal critique. Liberal criticism, growing out of liberalism as a philosophy or a political orientation, holds that enhancing individual freedom and autonomy is what we should all be aiming at. Our institutions, our organizations, our socialization should all be should all be moving in that direction to increase the range of freedom available to individuals. And liberal critics of gender stereotyping object to it because they see it, and this is often expressed in terms of children's socialization and aspirations and so forth. They see this stereotyping as limiting the way people can think about the choices and the options available to them and the way they can think about their paths sort of in the future. So the phrase, if you can see it, you can be it, or if you don't see it, you can't be it, comes out of the liberal critique of media. Here is an example illustrating the influence of the liberal critique. Here are two medical TV shows, hospital-based shows, drama, romance, crises, dramatic storylines, intrigue, and so forth, separated by a few decades. If you look really, really hard, you might spot a difference between the two groups of characters. And that difference, that increased representation of people that aren't, kind of tall white men with one nurse thrown in, is a result of how strong the liberal critique of gender stereotyping has been. But the liberal critique is not the only one possible. Marxist critique does argue that gendered stereotypes represent sexism in the service of capitalism. And they object to gender stereotyping because Marxist critics would see this as a way to create sort of false needs, or the idea that, we have to have this product, we have to buy this, we have to purchase that. And in order to induce that sense of a need within people, to make people into consumers, certain types of consumption are portrayed as gender congruent, as appropriate for gender. So Sex and the City came in for piles of criticism on that level, because of the sort of constant placement of products and the constant associations being drawn between a kind of carefree, independent, but still very feminine way of living, and the purchase or consumption of everything from mixed alcoholic drinks to types of beds to everything else. So the Marxists would say what's wrong with gender stereotyping is that it is a way of promoting the idea that one needs to consume certain goods, one needs to have these, purchase these certain things, engage in market transactions as a way of uh, establishing one's sort of gender congruence with with the images that are being given to us. So sexism in the service of capitalism is another angle of critique. Radical criticism argues that what's wrong with stereotyping is that it's never just stereotyping. It's never, women are like apples and men are like oranges or something like that. It's always a form of legitimizing or justifying or promoting an unequal relationship in which female subordination and male dominance is presented as the natural or even desirable state of the world. So mainstream media is seen as one institution among very many which reproduces patriarchy. It's profitable for the producers of Twilight or Sex and the City or what have you to set things up this way. People respond to these images that they are, as the critics say, interpolated by them. But what's going on, kind of, like the man behind the curtain, what's going on is the reproduction of patriarchy, not just entertainment or selling goods, pushing advertising. So that's where the radical critique comes up, that a stereotype is never just a matter of kind of neutral group characteristics. It's always engaged or harnessed in the perpetuation of inequality. One of the most important ideas to come out of the radical critique of gender in mainstream media is the notion of the male gaze, developed by Laura Mulvey in 1975. And the idea of the male gaze doesn't mean that, men are the only people who watch movies or watch TV or what have you. But Mulvey uses it to refer to the presentation of images, particularly of women, as though they were seen by this kind of imagined, idealized viewer who is a heterosexual man. And as one of the people who's written about the male gaze, Schroeder, has said that a gaze is more than just looking at something. Like, I'm looking at my foot or a cat or whatever. To gaze implies more than to look at. It signifies a psychological relationship of power in which the gazer is superior to the object of the gaze. So if you are the object of the gaze, you sort of exist in relation to the desires and the wishes and the interests of the person who is gazing at you. And studies of the male gaze, even though the male gaze in some ways is a fiction, it's like the male gazer is an idealized or kind of imagined person who's there watching the movie or the TV show or what have you. Where the male gaze is influential in media products, we find a presentation, particularly of women, as a lot of emphasis on physical attractiveness, whatever the beauty standards of a certain time and place may deem sexually appealing. Reacting to men, the woman who is the object of the male gaze seldom initiates action, but frequently reacts to or responds to or is involved in men's action. and dependency. The woman who is the object of the male gaze needs the man to support her, to save her, to validate or to recognize her existence in the world. So the interpersonal dynamics of media products where the male gaze is prominent get reduced to this imbalanced gender relation of the woman who's the object of the gaze appealing to this imagined straight male viewer, reacting to the men who are also in the movie or the film or the TV show or what have you, and being dependent on them in some way or other. One area where the male gaze is particularly um, unpleasant is in the area uh, of crime and horror movies. And I'm quoting here from Dr. Michelle Mayer, who's in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies here at U of A, who has studied horror movies. And a couple of things she said to me in our conversations have stuck with me. And the first is that horror movies, slasher movies, as well as most crime drama, kind of presumes a male viewer who can identify with what's going on with the male characters in the media product. So in slasher movies, um, not a genre I'm really familiar with, but I trust the people who do study them. Boys or male characters die because they make a mistake. They do the wrong thing. They, you know, attack the zombie with a weapon that's not adequate or something like that. And that's how they die. Girl characters die just because they die. They're not actively engaged in the confrontation, in the back and forth between the antagonist and the protagonist. They're almost collateral. They die in order to, because in a slasher movie, it's a good thing to have girls die, because that kind of establishes what sort of movie this is, and it fuels the drive of the male characters to persevere or to survive or what have you. Michelle also pointed out, and once it's one of these things that once you realize it, you start seeing it all the time. Why does every episode of CSI, one of the most successful media products ever, start with a dead woman? So the first, with every episode, the first female character that you see is murdered, dies, becomes the victim, and then the rest of the episode is sort of figuring out what happened and so forth. This isn't literally exactly true. There are indeed episodes of CSI that don't involve a woman dying right at the beginning, but there are many, many that do. And as Dr. Mayer points out, the killing off the female character at the beginning of the episode usually happens right before the first commercial break. So that becomes the hook, this death, which will then be resolved by a team of investigators who are predominantly, though not entirely, men. This death becomes the hook to get viewers to stick with the TV show, to come back after the commercials and watch the rest of it. And Dr. Mayer argues that this is set up for the male gaze. Here is this victim who is in need, who is dependent on men to set things right. And what's happened to her is just kind of the pretext for men to, and their female colleagues, to set things right. And finally, postmodern views on gender in mainstream media push against the idea that you can have sort of totalizing theories about the male gaze or about the commodification of gender. And postmodern scholars tend to point out media, even mainstream media, is complex and it's conflicted. We can't say it's doing this one thing and not this other thing because it's doing everything at the same time. So media, mainstream media, especially in the early 21st century, both reproduces and challenges, transforms ideas and stereotypes about gender. The power of the mainstream media is not entirely repressive, acting to sort of squash or stamp down independence or emancipation or equality amongst viewers. It's repressive and it's also emancipatory at the same time. Sorry, people get new ideas about gendered possibilities, how to be a gendered, being, living their life from the media at the same time as they absorb stereotypes about this is what being gendered male is like, this is what being gendered female is like. So postmodern views say it is all over the place. You can't, as soon as you make one general statement, a million exceptions are going to pop up. There's so much going on in mainstream media all the time.